My wife used to joke all the time. If you go to the next world, I will live with a horse. He has the same thing as you, even bigger. I thought it was just a joke. I didn't pay much attention to these words. But after one event, I immediately remembered these words and realized what kind of horse she was talking about. Hello? My name is Nick. I'm a regular guy with a regular life, or at least I thought I was. I met my wife, Amanda, 5 years ago at a horse riding club outside of Denver. She was a jockey with a wild spirit, the kind of person who seemed born to be in motion. Watching her command her horse, Luna, a sleek black mare who moved like the wind, was something to see. She was bold and skilled, moving like she was one with Luna. I used to think that was what drew me in, this energy she had for her riding. I thought she was magnetic. So, when she wanted to make her riding career a central focus, I was fine with it, happy to play the supportive role. After all, isn't that what good partners do? That was how things were for a while. Amanda focused on her riding and me cheering her on from the sidelines. But then, slowly, things started to shift. She began staying later at the riding trails, claiming she was working overtime to perfect her form or build up stamina. More intense competition coming up, she'd say with that focused look in her eyes. She'd mention how she was pushing herself harder than ever. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? That's who she was, driven, determined, always trying to be better. So I'd go about my day, thinking everything was as normal as it could be. Then one evening, she mentioned someone new, a guy named Jeremy Baines. He was apparently a new rider at her club, though I never met him. It started off innocently enough, just a few mentions of his name here and there. Jeremy really knows his stuff, she'd say. He has a way with horses you don't see every day. She'd talk about his technique, his skill, his dedication, qualities she clearly admired. I figured he was another rider who shared her passion, someone she could talk horses with without boring them to death like she could with me. So I'd laugh it off, encourage her, and let it go. But after a while, it was like Jeremy was all she talked about. Every conversation circled back to him. Jeremy managed to get his horse to jump a 6-foot hurdle without a problem, she'd say, or, he's so disciplined. Watching him makes me want to train even harder. I'll admit, a small alarm went off in my mind when I noticed this pattern, but I brushed it off. This was Amanda's world, after all, and if Jeremy was motivating her, then it was good for her riding career, right? Then, one night, Amanda didn't come home. No call, no text. Nothing. I sat there, eyes on the clock, watching the hours tick by as my mind churned with worry. Midnight turned to 1, then 2. I felt sick with worry, picturing every awful possibility. What if she'd been thrown from Luna? What if something had happened on the trail? I kept waiting for her to walk in, saying something about losing track of time, but she didn't. I eventually passed out on the couch, too exhausted to keep watching the door. Around 3 in the morning, I jolted awake to the soft click of the front door. Amanda crept in, trying to be quiet, her boots in hand, but I was already up, staring at her. She froze when she saw me, her face showing just the slightest flicker of guilt before she forced a tired smile. Sorry, Nick, she said too lightly. Lost track of time. Luna was all wound up tonight, and it took forever to calm her down. I stared at her, taking in the way her cheeks were flushed, her hair a little messy, her eyes avoiding mine. I could feel something dark forming inside me, but I pushed it down, telling myself she'd never lie to me. But that look on her face, I couldn't shake it. As she slipped off to bed, that flicker of doubt only grew stronger. From then on, she came home late more often, each time with a different excuse. I had to try out a new training technique. Or, Luna's getting stubborn, she takes forever to calm down. Each reason sounded just good enough to believe, but each one chipped away at the trust one thought we had. When she talked about Jeremy, she was glowing in a way I hadn't seen in months. There was this light in her eyes. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I could feel it eating away at me. One Friday night, she announced she had another late training session. then slipped out with barely a glance back at me. That was it, the final straw. I grabbed my keys, waited 10 minutes, and then followed her, keeping a safe distance as I tailed her car down a dark road leading out of town. She turned down a trail I knew led deep into the woods, a spot where the riding paths twisted through the trees. I parked a good distance away and crept down the trail after her. I could hear the faint crunch of gravel under her boots and the quiet, steady breathing of Luna as she rode further in. My heart pounded as I followed, keeping to the shadows. After a few minutes, I heard her laughing. And then I saw him. Jeremy was waiting by a clearing, his own horse grazing nearby. He looked too comfortable, leaning back against a tree, watching as Amanda approached. I stayed out of sight, hidden behind a thick patch of bushes, as Amanda dismounted, her laughter echoing through the quiet night. My stomach twisted as I watched her walk straight to him, practically glowing with excitement. She moved with a freedom I hadn't seen in months. Jeremy pulled her close, and for a moment, I was frozen. And then, just like that, they kissed. My hands shook, my breath caught in my throat, and my mind went blank as I watched the woman I'd built my life around in the arms of someone else. I wanted to run out and confront her, to tear this Jeremy guy apart with my bare hands. But I stayed put, too stunned, too angry, too numb to do anything but watch. I stumbled back down the trail, my mind racing. When I got to my car, I sat there in the darkness, staring out at the empty road. Every single moment with her replayed in my head, every smile, every excuse, every lie. The pain was like nothing I'd ever felt, raw and burning, tearing through me in waves. And that's when a single thought hit me, cold and clear: she was going to pay for this. After that night, everything changed. I kept playing back what I'd seen, every moment I watched Amanda with him. It felt like a knife twisting inside me each time I thought about it, but the anger, that kept me going. I needed to be smart about this. Rushing in and confronting her right away wouldn't do any good. No, if I was going to make her feel what I felt, it had to be on my terms. I'd wait for the right moment, the perfect chance to turn her life upside down. For the next few days, I played the part. I acted like I didn't know a thing, pretending to be the same, clueless husband she thought I was. But now, I was watching her more closely, picking up on every little detail. I noticed the way she'd check her phone a bit too often, how her face would light up at a message, only for her to catch herself and quickly look away. Sometimes she'd get a text and give me that same excuse, saying it was just the trainer, or one of the girls at the stables. I knew exactly who it was, and it took everything in me not to confront her right then and there. Then, one evening, she came home later than usual. I could hear her in the hallway, fumbling with her keys. I'd been pretending to be asleep on the couch, but the moment she walked in, I sat up. She froze, looking a bit like a deer in headlights. "Hey," she said, voice a little too chipper. "Didn't expect you to be up." She moved quickly, dropping her bag, her hands tugging at her hair, just a bit too casual. I raised an eyebrow. "You're home pretty late." She shrugged, brushing it off. "You know how it is. Luna's been difficult lately. She just wouldn't settle down." I nodded slowly, keeping my face blank. "Right. That must be exhausting." She laughed nervously. "Yeah. But I'm fine. Just need a shower." Without another word, she disappeared into the bathroom, the door clicking shut behind her. I sat there, staring at the empty spot where she'd stood, feeling every bit of patience I had starting to chip away. But I couldn't lose my cool. Not yet. A couple of days later, she left for another late training session. This time, I didn't follow her. I wanted to, but I needed a plan, a real one, something that would cut deep. And that's when an idea hit me. I remembered something one of my buddies had told me about his wife's horse getting spooked and throwing her after a bad fall. She'd had to take a break from riding while the horse was given some sedatives to calm it down. I realized that could be my way to get back at her, a subtle way to start my plan without her suspecting a thing. The following day, while Amanda was out on errands, I drove to a friend's place, a vet tech who owed me a favor. I explained I needed something to calm Luna down, acting like I was just looking out for Amanda. Nothing serious, I said. Just something that might take the edge off. She nodded, gave me a small vial, and explained how it worked. I thanked her and slipped the vial into my pocket, a strange sense of calm settling over me. This was the first step. The night Amanda was supposed to meet Jeremy again, I waited for her to get ready. She was in high spirits, practically glowing as she hurried out the door, telling me not to wait up because she'd probably be out late. I waved her off, pretending I was fine with it, then went straight to the stables where she kept Luna. The stables were empty at that hour, and it was easy to get inside without anyone seeing. Luna stood there, calm and quiet in her stall. I slipped in, reaching out to stroke her neck. Nothing personal, I muttered, pulling out the vial. I drew out the dose as instructed, then injected it into her neck. It was supposed to kick in after about 45 minutes, and would last for an hour or so. Just enough time to shake Amanda up. I left quickly, making sure everything looked untouched, then drove to the same wooded spot where I'd followed Amanda before. I parked a little off the trail, hidden from view, and waited. Sure enough, after about 30 minutes, I saw her leading Luna down the path. She was in a hurry, probably eager to see Jeremy. She didn't even glance around, just mounted up and rode out toward the clearing. Keeping to the shadows, I followed her at a safe distance, feeling the adrenaline kick in as I caught up with them. Jeremy was already there, his horse tied to a tree as he waited. The way he looked at her made my blood boil, but I kept my cool, hidden just out of sight. She dismounted, laughing as she walked over to him, and within seconds, they were in each other's arms, oblivious to everything around them. I took out my phone, hit record, and zoomed in on them. I wanted evidence, proof that would leave her nowhere to hide. My hands were steady as I filmed them, catching every moment, every touch, every stolen kiss. The anger inside me was barely contained, but I kept recording, watching as they pulled away and whispered to each other, laughing softly like it was some kind of game. Then, just as they started to get closer, I heard a sudden noise, a faint, distressed sound. I glanced over and saw Luna starting to sway, her legs unsteady, her head hanging low. Amanda noticed it too, her face going pale as she pulled back from Jeremy. "Luna?" she called out, her voice laced with panic. I kept filming, catching every second of her horror as she tried to steady the horse, talking to her in that soothing voice she used, but it was no use. Luna was going down. The drug was kicking in fast, and Amanda was helpless, watching as her prize horse, her companion, sank to the ground. "What's happening?" Jeremy asked, looking worried as he watched the horse struggle. I don't know," Amanda stammered, her voice shaking. "She's never done this before." She was nearly in tears, frantic as she tried to rouse Luna, but the horse lay there, breathing slowly, completely out of it. I took one last shot, capturing Amanda's panicked face, her hands trembling as she hovered over Luna, helpless and scared. Then I slipped back down the path, heading to my car and leaving her to deal with the mess. She'd be out there for a while, and I didn't want her to suspect a thing. I had what I needed, the footage, the proof. And now, I had my first victory. By the time she came home, it was nearly morning. I pretended to be asleep in bed, though I could hear her moving quietly, her footsteps hesitant as she came in. I could tell she was shaken, rattled by whatever excuse she'd come up with to justify Luna's sudden collapse. Over breakfast, she finally looked up, her face pale and eyes a little red. "Something happened last night," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh?" I asked, feigning concern. "What happened?" "Luna, she fell," Amanda stammered, clearly on edge. "Out of nowhere, she just went down. I don't know what happened." I fought back a smile, trying to keep my expression neutral. "That's strange," I said, nodding along. "Maybe she's been overworked?" Amanda shook her head, still visibly shaken. "I don't know. I've never seen her like that before." I leaned back, taking a sip of my coffee. "Well, I'm sure she'll be fine. I said, barely holding back my laughter. Maybe you just need to take it easy with her. Amanda nodded, her face filled with doubt as she stared down at her plate. She had no idea. Not yet. That morning, Amanda moved around the house like a ghost, quiet and visibly shaken, completely distracted as she fumbled with her keys, dropped her phone twice, and didn't meet my eyes once. I kept my distance, letting her unravel on her own. It was almost too easy watching her grow tense, wrapped up in whatever thoughts were churning through her head. I went through my usual morning routine, enjoying her nervous glances, the small signs that her mind was in chaos. By mid-morning, she said she needed to check on Luna, her voice unsteady. I just nodded, pretending to look concerned, and watched her walk out the door, hurrying to her car. The door closed behind her, and I exhaled, feeling the satisfaction of watching her worry from afar. She was finally off balance, grasping for control in a situation she hadn't even begun to understand. As soon as Amanda left, I pulled out my phone and played back the video I'd taken of her panicked reaction when Luna collapsed in the woods. It was almost surreal seeing her like that, so vulnerable, rattled, helpless. It was a far cry from the Amanda I'd known, and I found a sense of satisfaction in it, knowing that she was finally beginning to feel the weight of her own lies. When Amanda returned that evening, she looked exhausted. She barely greeted me, mumbling something about needing a shower, then disappeared into the bathroom. I sat back on the couch, pretending to be engrossed in a book, while she went through the motions of trying to relax, trying to put herself back together. But the anxiety was written all over her, in the way her shoulders slumped, in her empty gaze as she sat down across from me afterward, clutching a glass of wine. "Luna was better today," she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. "But I don't know. I've never seen her like that before. I feel like something's wrong." "Oh?" I said, looking up, keeping my expression neutral. "Maybe she just needs rest. Horses can get overworked, you know." Amanda hesitated, her eyes darting to me for a moment. "It's not just that," she murmured. "I feel off too. I don't know, like everything's slipping out of my hands." I let out a slow sigh, tilting my head. "Maybe it's just stress," I suggested. "Or maybe you're just worn out from all those late nights." My tone was sympathetic, but the subtle edge was clear. She flinched slightly, her shoulders tensing. I could tell my words were sinking in, stirring up doubts, and that was exactly what I wanted. The next day, she called in sick to work, saying she wanted to take Luna to a vet to make sure there was nothing wrong. I went about my day as usual, playing the supportive, oblivious husband. But the satisfaction inside me grew with every step she took toward her own unraveling. She was desperate, looking for answers that didn't exist. And I knew she wouldn't find anything because Luna wasn't the problem. When Amanda returned from the vet, she looked even more rattled. She shuffled around the house, quiet and tense, as if every sound was too loud. Later that night, she poured herself another glass of wine and glanced at me with a distant, almost haunted look. "The vet didn't find anything wrong with Luna," she murmured, almost as if she was talking to herself. "She said I should just monitor her." "Well, that's good news, right?" I said, pretending to sound relieved. "Maybe it was just a one-off." Amanda shook her head, staring down at her glass. "I don't know. I just feel like everything's going wrong lately. Like something's slipping out of control." I kept my expression sympathetic, feigning concern. "Maybe you need a break, Amanda. Some time to clear your head." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "Maybe." But the look on her face told me she was still lost in her own thoughts, her mind racing through endless possibilities, wondering what had gone wrong. Over the next few days, Amanda grew quieter, more withdrawn. She canceled a few training sessions, choosing instead to stay home, her face set in a tense, anxious frown as she spent hours reading up on horses and calling friends from her riding circle. She was clearly trying to solve the puzzle of Luna's strange behavior, but nothing satisfied her. She began talking to herself, muttering under her breath, almost as if she thought she'd missed something. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to find her staring at a notebook filled with scrawled notes on Luna's health, her hands clutching a half-empty glass of wine. Her eyes were glassy, her face tired. She glanced up as I entered, and I could tell she was barely holding herself together. "Nick, do you think I've been different lately?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pretended to think it over, then gave her a slow nod. "Maybe. You've seemed distracted, a little distant." Her gaze dropped, and she nodded slowly. I feel like I'm losing control," she said, almost to herself. "Like everything's just slipping." "Well, you know horses," I said, keeping my tone casual. "They can sense things we can't. Maybe Luna's just picking up on your tension." She stiffened at my words, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, playing it off. "Just that, if you're tense, maybe Luna's reacting to that." It was subtle, a gentle nudge, but I could see it hit her. Her face fell, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid, as if she was starting to see that her own actions were coming back to haunt her. The next morning, she called out of work again, saying she was sick. I pretended not to notice, even though it was obvious she wasn't sick in the usual sense. She was unraveling faster than I'd anticipated. Her usually composed self was frayed, each day more unsteady than the last. That evening, she didn't touch her dinner, only sat at the table in silence, staring blankly ahead. I could tell her mind was miles away, lost in her own fears and uncertainties. Finally, she looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "Nick, do you think we're okay?" The question took me by surprise, though I didn't let it show. I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I just feel like I'm not myself. Like everything's wrong." I reached across the table, placing my hand on hers. "Hey, you're probably just stressed. You're taking on so much lately, with work, with Luna, with everything. Maybe you just need some time to relax." She nodded, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. She was finally feeling the weight of everything, even if she couldn't quite understand why. And as she left the table, her shoulders slumped, I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. Over the next few days, her behavior grew even more erratic. She spent hours calling people from the riding club, asking endless questions about health issues and horses, searching for answers. Every time she came up empty-handed, the frustration built, and I could see her patience wearing thin. She was spiraling, trying to keep a grip on her world as it crumbled in her hands. I stayed quiet, watching from a distance, letting her stumble deeper into her own mess. It was a slow burn, a gradual descent, but it was perfect. Each day, she grew a little more isolated, a little more unsure. And I savored every second of it, knowing that soon, everything she'd built would come crashing down. It was only a matter of time. Amanda was unraveling, that much was clear. She grew quieter, her mind elsewhere, her every movement laced with tension. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was only about Luna. I kept up the act, playing the concerned husband, but inwardly, I was savoring every slip, every crack in her composure. One morning, Amanda left to take Luna on a trail ride, her eyes weary, as if she'd barely slept. She didn't tell me where she was going, just said she needed some time to clear her head. I nodded, letting her leave without a word, then grabbed my phone and got into my car, following her to the stables at a careful distance. I knew that whatever she was doing would reveal itself soon enough. I parked just down the road from the stables, watching from a distance as Amanda saddled Luna. She was talking to herself, her hands moving restlessly as she adjusted Luna's reins, muttering things I couldn't make out from where I sat. But her face was unmistakable, a mixture of exhaustion, frustration, and a creeping fear that she couldn't hide. Once she was out of sight, I left my car and headed into the stables. I had an idea, one that would keep her off balance even further. I grabbed a few handfuls of straw and scattered it around the entrance of Luna's stall, leaving enough to look like someone had been rummaging around. Then I gently loosened a latch on the stable door, just enough that it would look like someone had tampered with it. When Amanda returned that evening, she didn't mention the trail ride, but I could see the tension on her face. She went straight to the bathroom and turned on the shower, her movements slow, almost mechanical. I sat in the living room, pretending to read, listening as the water ran for nearly an hour. When she finally came out, she looked even more lost, her eyes haunted. At dinner, she barely touched her food, picking at her plate, while I ate in silence. Then, without warning, she put down her fork and looked at me, her eyes shadowed with doubt. "Nick, have you been out to the stables lately?" I looked up, feigning surprise. "The stables? No. Why?" She hesitated, glancing away. It looked like someone had been there. Like someone had been messing with Luna's stall." "Oh?" I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone light. "Maybe someone else was just borrowing some supplies. Or maybe it was the stable hand?" She shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "No, it was more than that. I don't know, Nick. I feel like something's off." She trailed off, and I could see the fear rising in her eyes. She was lost in her own thoughts, trapped in a cycle of worry and uncertainty. I set my fork down, leaning forward slightly. "Amanda," I said gently, "you've been under a lot of pressure lately. Maybe you're just imagining things?" She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. After a moment, she looked down, nodding slightly. "Yeah, maybe," she murmured. But I knew she didn't believe it. Not fully. The next day, she skipped work, staying home to rest, though I knew better. She spent most of the day pacing around the house, her phone in hand, calling friends from the riding club and asking endless questions about Luna's health, about the strange things she noticed in the stable. I listened to bits and pieces of her conversations, hiding a smile as I overheard her questions grow more frantic. She was beginning to suspect that something bigger was going on, though she had no idea what. I stayed out of her way, letting her worry, letting the doubt gnaw at her. By late afternoon, she was a wreck, her hair messy, her face drawn, and I could see she was barely holding herself together. That night, she left for another training session, her voice tight, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. She didn't look me in the eye as she left, mumbling a quick goodbye before slipping out the door. I knew she wasn't going to the trails this time. She was going to try to talk to someone, anyone, who could give her an explanation. She was desperate, looking for reassurance, looking for someone to tell her she wasn't losing control. Once she was gone, I grabbed my phone and called her best friend, Melanie. I hadn't spoken to Melanie in a while, but we'd always been friendly. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and casual. "Hey, Melanie. Sorry to call so late," I began, keeping my tone light. "But I was wondering if Amanda had mentioned anything to you lately, about her stress?" Melanie sounded surprised. "Oh. I mean, she's been a little off lately. She mentioned some trouble with Luna, but nothing too serious." I let out a sigh. She's been really anxious lately. She barely sleeps, barely eats. I think something's really weighing on her, but she won't tell me what it is." I paused, letting the silence linger for a moment before adding, I'm starting to worry about her." Melanie was quiet, and then she spoke softly. "Well, Nick, she's under a lot of pressure with her competitions coming up. Maybe it's just that, or maybe it's something else." Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the concern creeping in. "Yeah, maybe," I replied, my tone carefully measured. "I just wish she'd talk to me." We ended the call, and I sat back, satisfied. The seed was planted. I knew Melanie would reach out to Amanda, maybe even mention our conversation, and Amanda would have one more layer of uncertainty to deal with. She'd start wondering who else might notice her anxiety, who else might pick up on her secret. The next day, I found Amanda sitting in the living room, her face pale, her eyes distant. She looked up as I walked in, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to speak. Finally, she swallowed, looking down at her hands. "Nick, do you think I've been distant lately?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I sat down across from her, pretending to consider it. Maybe a little. But I thought it was just stress. Is everything all right? She shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know. I feel like I'm losing control of everything. Like I'm slipping. I leaned forward, reaching out to touch her hand. Amanda, you're probably just overworked. Maybe you need to take a break, get away from all the pressure. She looked up, her eyes filled with doubt. Maybe you're right. But her voice was empty, defeated, and I knew she was only saying it because she didn't know what else to believe. The days that followed were a slow descent. Amanda grew quieter, her movements slower, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She started skipping training sessions, choosing instead to stay home, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I could see her scanning through messages, looking for something, anything, that would make sense of it all. Then, one evening, she didn't even bother with an excuse. She just sat there, staring into space, her hands trembling. When I walked in, she looked up, her face a mixture of fear and frustration. Nick, do you think I'm losing it? She asked, her voice barely audible. I tilted my head, pretending to be surprised. Amanda, of course not. You've just been under a lot of stress. She nodded slowly, but her face remained clouded with doubt. She was spiraling, her mind trapped in a loop of confusion, and I could see that she was barely holding herself together. I knew that the final push was near. As she walked away, shoulders slumped, I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Amanda was right where I wanted her, lost, alone, and desperate for answers that would never come. It wouldn't be long now. Amanda was on the edge. Each day, she seemed further gone, the bright, confident person I had once known replaced by someone tired, drained, and entirely unsure of herself. Every day, she moved around the house like a ghost, her face etched with lines of worry and her eyes hollow. She barely spoke to me anymore, and when she did, it was like she was speaking from a distance, her voice faint and unfocused. One evening, she went out to the stables for what felt like the 100th time, mumbling about needing to check on Luna. I watched her go, her shoulders slumped, her face shadowed with exhaustion. I knew she was unraveling. She was paranoid, haunted by something she couldn't see or explain. And the best part? She didn't have a clue that it was all intentional. I gave her a few minutes, then followed her out, staying a safe distance behind. When I reached the stable entrance, I lingered just outside, peering in through a small window. Amanda was in Luna's stall, talking softly to her horse as she ran her hands along Luna's mane, her movements shaky and uncertain. It was strange, watching her like this. She seemed like a completely different person, fragile and lost. Just then, I saw her phone light up on the nearby table, vibrating with a notification. Her face tightened as she noticed it too, hesitating before walking over and picking it up. She glanced at the screen, and I saw her expression shift, a flicker of distress. She typed a quick response, her hands trembling, then set the phone down and returned to Luna, her shoulders tense. Curious, I waited until she was occupied in the stall, then slipped inside and reached for her phone, carefully keeping it out of her sight. I glanced at the screen. The message was from her friend Melanie, following up on a call they'd had earlier. Amanda had been confiding in Melanie, it seemed, telling her about Luna's strange behavior, about the feeling that something was wrong. But the last message was what caught my eye. Maybe you're just feeling guilty, Amanda. Are you sure you're just imagining this? Guilty. The word hung in the air, and I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Melanie was picking up on something, even if she didn't know what it was. Amanda was losing her grip, not just on herself, but on the image she had so carefully constructed. I slid her phone back onto the table and slipped out of the stable, satisfied. Amanda came home late that night, looking more frazzled than ever. She barely mumbled a greeting as she entered, heading straight to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. I watched her carefully, noting the way her hands shook as she lifted the glass, the way her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for something that wasn't there. She was spiraling, and I was just letting her fall. At dinner, she sat across from me, barely touching her food. After a long silence, she finally looked up, her face pale and her voice hesitant. Nick, do you ever feel like everything's slipping out of control? I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. What do you mean? She glanced away, her eyes clouded. I don't know, it's like I'm not myself anymore. Like something's wrong, and I can't put my finger on it. I let out a sympathetic sigh. Maybe you're just tired. You've been putting yourself under so much pressure lately. Amanda shook her head, her face tense. It's not just that. It's everything. I feel like I'm losing control, like I'm not the one in charge of my own life. Her voice broke slightly, and I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that she was trapped in something beyond her understanding. I kept my tone gentle, pretending to be understanding. Maybe it's just stress, Amanda. Maybe you're just overthinking things. She nodded, but the doubt was still there, lurking behind her eyes. She was searching for answers, but she was looking in the wrong places. And that was exactly what I wanted. Over the next few days, Amanda grew even more withdrawn. She started canceling her plans, skipping her training sessions, spending more and more time alone. I watched as she paced around the house, her face twisted in thought, occasionally muttering under her breath. She was lost in her own mind, consumed by whatever demons I'd planted, and I could see her unraveling by the day. Then, one evening, she surprised me. She came to me, her face pale and her voice barely a whisper. Nick, I think I might need help. I looked up, feigning concern. Help? What do you mean? She hesitated, looking down at her hands. I feel like I'm not myself. Like I can't trust myself anymore. I don't know what's happening to me. I kept my expression calm, hiding the satisfaction building inside me. Maybe you should see someone. Talk to a therapist or something. They could help you get to the bottom of this. She nodded slowly, as if considering it, but I could tell she was still unsure. Part of her wanted to believe that nothing was wrong, that it was all in her head. But another part, a growing part, was starting to realize that her life was slipping out of her hands. The next morning, she called her work and requested time off. She didn't tell me what she planned to do with the time, just said she needed a break. I watched her pack a small bag, her face set in a determined expression. She didn't say goodbye, just mumbled something about taking a drive to clear her head. I watched her leave, keeping my expression neutral, though inside I was smiling. She was running from her own mind, desperate for some kind of escape. She returned late that night, looking no better than before. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and I could tell her little escape hadn't done her any good. She was still hunted, still lost in her own thoughts. And I knew that whatever she'd hoped to find out there, she hadn't found it. That night, as she lay beside me in bed, I heard her whisper something into the darkness. What's happening to me? Her voice was broken, filled with a fear I'd never heard from her before. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep, savoring the moment. She was finally facing the weight of her own lies, and there was nothing she could do to escape it. The next day, I decided to add one final touch to the plan. I left a note on the kitchen counter, carefully written in my own handwriting. It was simple, vague, but just enough to feed her paranoia. Sometimes, the truth is right in front of us, and we're just too blind to see it. When Amanda came down for breakfast, she noticed the note, her face going pale as she picked it up and read it. Her hands shook as she held it, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Nick, did you write this? She asked, her voice trembling. I looked up, pretending to be surprised. Write what? She held up the note, her face a mixture of anger and desperation. Did you write this? I glanced at it, feigning confusion. Amanda, I have no idea what that is. Maybe you left it for yourself? Her face fell, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. She turned away, clutching the note in her hand, her expression haunted. She was lost, completely adrift, with no way of knowing what was real and what wasn't. Over the following days, I watched as she unraveled further, her mind a tangled mess of doubt and fear. She was barely eating, barely sleeping, her every movement slow and shaky. I could see her losing herself, slipping into the very trap she had set for herself with her lies. It wouldn't be long now. She was on the brink, hanging by a thread. And soon, very soon, everything she'd done would come crashing down around her. Amanda was a shell of herself, barely hanging on to reality. She moved around the house like a stranger, her mind distant, her once confident steps now hesitant, as if she was afraid the floor might fall out beneath her. Every conversation was filled with tension, and every glance she cast over her shoulder revealed her growing paranoia. One evening, she came to me with a strange look in her eyes. "Nick, I think someone's been following me." I looked up from my book, keeping my expression neutral. "Following you? What makes you think that?" She sat down across from me, her face pale and her eyes darting around the room. "I feel like there's someone watching me. Every time I go to the stables, every time I go anywhere. I keep seeing shadows. Hearing things." I put on my best sympathetic face, nodding slowly. "Amanda, you've been really stressed lately. Maybe your mind is just playing tricks on you." Her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. "No, Nick. I know what I saw. I'm not imagining this." Her voice wavered, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as she was me. "Well, maybe you need a break," I suggested, keeping my tone gentle. "Take a few days off, stay at home, try to relax." She nodded absently, but I could see the doubts still gnawing at her. The fear in her eyes told me that she was trapped in her own mind, unable to separate reality from her nightmares. She was right where I wanted her, losing her grip, questioning every shadow and whisper. And I knew it wouldn't be long before she finally broke. The next day, she didn't leave the house at all. She spent hours pacing around the kitchen, checking her phone, scrolling through old messages as if she was searching for answers that weren't there. Occasionally, I'd catch her glancing out the window, her eyes scanning the empty driveway, the still trees, as if she expected someone, or something, to appear. As the afternoon dragged on, I decided to take things further. While she was distracted in the kitchen, I slipped into the living room and placed a small, folded note on the coffee table. It was simple, but direct, designed to heighten her paranoia even more. "You can't hide from the truth." Later, as I watched from the hallway, Amanda entered the living room, stopping short as she spotted the note. She picked it up slowly, unfolding it with trembling fingers, her face a mask of horror as she read the words. She glanced around, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short gasps. Then she looked up, catching sight of me standing in the doorway. "Nick, did you write this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I feigned surprise, walking over to her. "What's that?" I took the note from her hand, pretending to study it. "Amanda, I don't know what this is. Are you sure you didn't leave it for yourself?" Her face crumpled, a mix of anger and confusion. Why would I leave something like this for myself?" I shrugged, keeping my tone calm. "I don't know, Amanda. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you wrote it and forgot." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't forget." I reached out, touching her shoulder gently. "Hey, it's okay. You're under a lot of stress. Maybe you just need some rest." But my words didn't soothe her. She backed away, clutching the note like it was some kind of curse, her face pale and her hands shaking. She was spiraling, her mind fraying at the edges, and I could see that she was on the verge of a complete breakdown. That night she barely slept. I could hear her moving around in the dark, her footsteps soft and hesitant, as if she was trying to keep quiet but couldn't stay still. At one point, I opened my eyes to see her standing by the window, staring out into the empty street, her face tight with worry. She was haunted, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, and she didn't have a clue that I was the one pulling the strings. The next morning, Amanda left for the stables, her face drawn, her eyes red from lack of sleep. I waited until she was gone, then followed her, keeping my distance as I trailed her to the edge of the woods near the trails. I parked a short distance away, watching as she moved to Luna's stall and started preparing her for a ride. But she looked hesitant, her movements shaky, her eyes constantly darting around the stable. She seemed afraid, as if she was waiting for something terrible to happen. And in a way, she was right. As she led Luna down the trail, I stayed hidden, watching her every move. She rode slowly, her head turning at every sound, her posture tense and defensive. She was searching for answers, but I knew she wouldn't find them. Not here, not anywhere. She was lost in her own mind, and I was just letting her drift further away. After a while, she dismounted, tying Luna's reins to a tree as she walked a short distance down the trail. I followed her, staying hidden, watching as she stood by the riverbank, staring at her own reflection in the water. She looked so small, so lost, like she was seeing a stranger in the glassy surface of the river. I could see her trembling, her hands clutching her arms, her face etched with sorrow. She stayed there for a while, lost in thought, then slowly made her way back to Luna. As she approached her horse, Luna suddenly reared back, her eyes wide with panic. Amanda froze, her face pale as she watched her horse struggle against the reins, pulling and bucking as if she was terrified of something nearby. I stayed hidden, my camera rolling, capturing every second as Amanda tried to calm Luna, her voice trembling with fear and desperation. "Luna, please, please calm down." But Luna was too far gone, her eyes wild, her nostrils flaring as she fought against Amanda's grip. And for the first time, I saw genuine terror in Amanda's eyes, a raw, primal fear as she realized she was losing control, not just of her horse, but of herself. Finally, Luna broke free, tearing down the trail as Amanda stood there, helpless, watching her vanish into the woods. She collapsed to her knees, her hands covering her face as she sobbed, her shoulders shaking with a grief that went deeper than just losing control of her horse. She was broken, defeated, her spirit shattered by the weight of everything she'd done, everything she'd hidden. I watched from the shadows, filming her as she crumbled, savoring the victory I'd waited for so long to see. She was completely alone, abandoned by everyone she'd once relied on, and she had nowhere to turn. She was drowning, and there was no one there to pull her up. When Amanda finally returned home that evening, she looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single day. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face blank, her eyes empty. She barely spoke, didn't eat, didn't even look at me as she passed by. And I knew, in that moment, that I had won. Amanda's spirit was shattered. She was barely a shadow now, drifting through our home with an emptiness that had become almost eerie. She'd stopped talking to her friends, stopped going to the stables, and even Luna, the one constant in her life, had become something she avoided. She was scared of her own shadow, flinching at every sound, every creak of the floorboards. I watched her, waiting for the next crack to deepen, knowing that the final moment was drawing close. One night she came into the living room while I was watching TV, her face pale, her hands twisting nervously. "Nick, do you think I'm crazy?" I looked up, feigning concern. "Why would you think that, Amanda?" Her eyes were hollow, staring into the distance. "Because I don't know what's real anymore. I feel like I'm not in control. Like I'm living in a nightmare." Her voice was weak, trembling with fear, and I could see that she was on the verge of breaking. I kept my expression soft, hiding the satisfaction I felt. "Amanda, maybe you should talk to someone. This stress, it's taking a toll on you." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Her guilt, her fear, they trapped her, spinning webs around her that she couldn't see through anymore. She was close to the edge, but she wasn't quite there yet. I knew what I needed to do to push her the rest of the way. The next day, while she was out, I went through her belongings, searching for something personal, something that would serve as the final blow. I found her journal tucked away in a drawer. I flipped through it, skimming entries from years ago, back when she'd first started her career. Back when she'd been passionate, confident, a woman who believed she could conquer anything. And then I found the entries about him. Jeremy. Notes about their training sessions, her thoughts on his talent, her admiration, her guilt over spending time with him. Reading them, I could feel the pieces fitting together, a perfect picture of a woman who had lost herself. That evening, I left the journal open on her pillow, turned to one of the most personal pages, a passage where she'd written about her fears, her insecurities, her growing feelings for Jeremy. It was raw, honest, a window into her soul. And I knew that when she saw it, she'd feel the weight of her own guilt crushing down on her. When Amanda came home, I stayed out of sight, lingering in the hallway as she went upstairs. I heard her footsteps stop, a sharp intake of breath. There was silence, then the sound of pages turning, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. She was reading her own words, reliving the guilt, the betrayal. And I could feel her breaking with each line. She came down a few minutes later, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched the journal. "Nick, did you read this?" I looked up, feigning confusion. "What?" She held up the journal, her eyes wide, pleading. "Did you read this? Did you know?" I kept my voice calm, pretending not to understand. "Amanda, what are you talking about?" She let out a choked sob, clutching the journal to her chest. I don't know what's happening anymore. I feel like I'm losing my mind." I walked over, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Amanda, maybe it's time you faced whatever it is you're hiding. Maybe that's what's causing all of this." Her face twisted, and she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I can't. With that, she turned and fled upstairs, slamming the door behind her. I heard her sobs through the walls, the sound of someone falling apart piece by piece. She was unraveling, each thread of her former self coming undone, and there was no one there to catch her. Over the next few days, Amanda became almost unrecognizable. She barely slept, barely ate, spending her days lost in her own mind. She wandered through the house in silence, her eyes blank, her face pale. I watched her, biding my time, knowing that she was on the verge of collapse. Then, one morning, she came to me with a look of utter despair. "Nick, I think I need help." I looked at her, hiding my satisfaction. "What kind of help, Amanda?" She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's real." I reached out, squeezing her hand gently. "Amanda, you're not alone. I'm here for you. But maybe it's time you let go of whatever's haunting you. You can't keep running from the truth." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. She was on the edge, her mind teetering on the brink. And I knew that the final push was near. The following night, I slipped another note onto her bedside table. This one was different, a direct message, leaving no room for interpretation. "I know what you did. I've known all along." When Amanda found the note the next morning, her reaction was immediate. She screamed, the sound echoing through the house, a raw, guttural cry of terror. I waited, listening as she tore through the room, throwing open drawers, scattering papers, searching for some explanation, some answer that would make sense of her nightmare. But there was nothing. Just her own mind, closing in on her like a cage. She ran down the stairs, her face twisted with fear, her eyes wild as she looked at me, clutching the note in her trembling hands. "Nick, please, you have to help me. I can't do this anymore." I looked at her, keeping my voice steady. "Amanda, you're only feeling this way because you're hiding something. Whatever it is, you have to face it. It's the only way you'll find peace." Her face crumpled, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She was broken, every ounce of strength drained from her, and I knew that she was finally at her limit. She had nothing left, no fight, no defenses. She was utterly, completely shattered. Over the next few days, Amanda retreated further into herself. She barely spoke, barely moved, her once vibrant spirit now a hollow shell. I watched her, knowing that my work was nearly complete. She had lost everything, her confidence, her sanity, her sense of self. And there was no coming back. Finally, one evening, she came to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Nick, I can't go on like this. I looked at her, feigning concern. Amanda, maybe it's time you told me the truth. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, her voice choked. I can't. I can't. And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the house. I stayed where I was, knowing that she was gone, lost in a world she'd created for herself, a world she could never escape. The end was near. Amanda was fading fast. She spent her days wandering through the house, her eyes vacant, her face etched with despair. She was caught in a web of guilt and paranoia, and every time I saw her, it was as though she'd lost another part of herself. Her spirit was broken, her confidence gone. She was nothing like the vibrant, determined woman I'd married. And that, I told myself, was exactly what she deserved. One night, as I sat in the living room, I heard her footsteps coming down the stairs. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She was holding a letter in her hands, her fingers trembling as she clutched it tightly. Nick, I need to talk to you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I set down my book, nodding. Of course, Amanda. What's on your mind? She looked down at the letter, her shoulders slumping as she took a shaky breath. I wrote this. It's a confession. Everything I've done, everything I've hidden. She paused, her voice catching. I can't keep running from it, Nick. I can't keep living like this. I kept my expression calm, hiding the satisfaction that was building inside me. What are you confessing to, Amanda? She looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. To everything, to all the lies. To hurting you, to betraying you. She choked back a sob, clutching the letter tightly. I've been so selfish, Nick. I've lied to you, hurt you, and I don't even know who I am anymore. I reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. Amanda, we all make mistakes. But running from the truth isn't going to make things any easier. She nodded, wiping her eyes, her voice filled with desperation. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix myself. For a moment, I almost felt a flicker of sympathy. She was completely broken, her spirit crushed, her mind tangled in a web of her own creation. But then I reminded myself of everything she'd done, every lie, every betrayal. She deserved this, I told myself. She deserved every ounce of suffering. Maybe you can start by being honest, I said, my voice calm. With yourself, and with me. She looked up at me, her face etched with guilt. Nick, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve anything. I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. Maybe not. But if you want to make things right, you have to start somewhere. She took a deep, shuddering breath, nodding as she clutched the letter to her chest. Thank you, Nick. I don't know if I can ever make this up to you, but thank you. She turned and walked back up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of finality. Amanda was lost, broken beyond repair. And soon, she'd have no choice but to confront everything she tried to bury. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. She didn't look up when I entered the room, her face pale and her eyes empty. She seemed like she was somewhere else entirely, her mind trapped in some dark, endless spiral. I sat down across from her, studying her face. Amanda, are you okay? She looked up at me slowly, her eyes dull and lifeless. Nick, I don't think I can go on like this. I feigned concern, reaching out to touch her hand. What do you mean? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's real, what's true. It's like I'm trapped in my own mind, and there's no way out. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Maybe this is your chance to start over. To be honest, to be real, to face whatever it is you've been hiding. She closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping as she took a shaky breath. I've hurt so many people, Nick. I've hurt you, I've hurt myself, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. I kept my tone calm, measured. Amanda, sometimes the only way to find peace is to let go. To stop fighting, to stop running. To just accept things as they are. She opened her eyes, looking at me with a mixture of fear and resignation. I don't know if I can do that, Nick. I don't know if I'm strong enough. I leaned back, watching her, waiting for her to come to her own conclusion. She was teetering on the edge, caught between the person she used to be and the person she'd become. And I knew that soon, she would have to make a choice. That evening, she went to bed early, her face etched with exhaustion. I stayed downstairs, listening as she moved around the bedroom, her footsteps slow, deliberate. Finally, the house fell silent, and I knew she had slipped into the only escape she had left, sleep. In the middle of the night, I crept upstairs and placed one final note on her nightstand. It was simple, just a single line, but I knew it would haunt her when she woke up. There's no escaping the truth. When she found it the next morning, I watched as her face crumpled, her hands trembling as she read the words. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a kind of desperation I'd never seen before. Nick, please, tell me this isn't happening. Tell me I'm not losing my mind. I looked at her, my face expressionless. Amanda, you know what's real. Deep down, you know. Her face twisted with despair, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I don't know anything anymore. I feel like I'm already gone. For the next few days, Amanda withdrew further into herself. She barely left the bedroom, barely spoke. She was a hollow shell, a ghost, her mind unraveling, her spirit broken. She had lost everything, and there was nothing left for her to hold on to. Finally, one morning, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at me, her eyes empty. Nick, I don't want to go on like this. I sat down beside her, my voice soft. Then don't. Let go, Amanda. Stop fighting, stop running. Just let go. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. How do I do that? How do I let go? I placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of her guilt, her shame, her sorrow. You already know how, Amanda. You just have to take the first step. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. She was lost, defeated, a woman who had destroyed herself with her own lies. And as she sat there, silent, I knew that the end was near. Later that day, I packed my things, taking only what I needed, leaving behind the life we had once shared. I knew that she was beyond saving, that her guilt, her betrayal had consumed her. And as I walked out the door, leaving her behind, I felt a strange sense of closure. Amanda had lost herself, and there was nothing left for her to cling to. She had built her own prison, and now she was trapped in it, forever haunted by the truths she could no longer escape. The house was quiet as I closed the door behind me, leaving Amanda alone inside with nothing but her guilt and regret to keep her company. I didn't look back as I walked down the driveway, feeling the weight of all the years, the betrayals, and the lies fall away. I'd planned this moment meticulously, calculated every step, every turn that had led her to this breaking point. But as I stood there on the street, an unexpected emptiness crept in. I checked into a hotel that night, figuring I'd stay a few days to figure out my next steps, maybe even make a clean break from the life Amanda and I had built together. But no sooner had I unpacked than my phone buzzed with a message. Nick, please come back. I can't do this alone. The message was simple, raw. It was almost pitiful. A flicker of something twisted inside me, a tug at the satisfaction I'd felt walking away. For a brief moment, I considered replying, but I didn't. I left the message on read, and set the phone down, letting her desperation linger unanswered. The next morning, I woke to a second message, this one just as desperate as the last. Nick, I'm sorry. Please, just talk to me. I don't know what to do. I stared at the screen for a long time, my mind drifting back to the beginning, to the way she used to look at me, to the way she'd smile after a long day, to all the moments I'd once cherished. But those memories had been tainted by everything I'd seen, everything she'd hidden from me. I couldn't shake the image of her and Jeremy, of the way she had betrayed everything we'd built. And just like that, any trace of sympathy vanished. I decided to stop reading the messages altogether, knowing they'd only be filled with more apologies, more pleas. Amanda was trapped, not just in her guilt, but in the ruins of the life she tried to build on lies. And there was no way out for her now. She'd have to face it alone. Days turned into weeks, and the messages kept coming. At first, they were filled with sorrow, remorse, desperation. But slowly, they became something else, something darker, more fractured. The messages grew more sporadic, sometimes incoherent, filled with phrases that made no sense, questions that had no answers. And then, one day, they simply stopped. At first, I thought it was a relief, the end of a long, torturous chapter. But as the days went on, an uneasy feeling crept into the edges of my mind. Had she finally given up? Had she reached her breaking point in a way I hadn't anticipated? The satisfaction I'd felt started to erode, replaced by something else, something that felt like guilt, though I fought against it with everything I had. I waited another week, telling myself that it didn't matter, that she was no longer my concern. But eventually, curiosity, and perhaps some remnant of attachment I didn't want to admit to, drove me back to the house. When I pulled into the driveway, the place looked deserted. Amanda's car was still there, parked in the same spot, but the house itself seemed different, like it had been abandoned. The front lawn had grown wild, the windows were dark, and a stillness hung over the place that made my stomach twist. I walked up to the door, hesitating for a moment before letting myself in. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural silence. I called out her name, but there was no answer. Every room was empty, untouched, as if frozen in time. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Finally, I made my way upstairs, a growing sense of dread settling over me as I approached our bedroom. The door was closed, and I paused, my hand hovering over the handle, feeling a strange, inexplicable reluctance. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. There, on the bed, was Amanda's journal, open to the last page. A single line was scrawled across the page in shaky handwriting, a message that sent a chill down my spine. "I don't know who I am anymore." The words seemed to echo through the room, a haunting reminder of the woman who had once been so sure of herself, so full of life. Now she was gone, lost to a darkness that I had played a hand in creating. I looked around, half expecting to see her standing there, but the room was empty, cold, a hollow shell of what it had once been. I turned and left, my mind numb, the reality of what I'd done settling over me like a weight I hadn't anticipated. I had wanted revenge, had craved the satisfaction of watching her unravel. And I had gotten exactly what I'd wanted. But as I left that empty house, a strange emptiness followed me, a void that no amount of retribution could fill. For the first time, I felt the weight of my own actions, the consequences of a plan that had been calculated, ruthless, and devastatingly effective. I had destroyed her, just as I'd intended. But in doing so, I had destroyed a part of myself, too, a part one could never get back. As I drove away, the words from her journal echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the woman I had loved, the life we had built, and the emptiness that had been left behind. And for the first time, I wondered if revenge had really been worth the cost. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.